On Mother's Day, my millionaire son stood in my kitchen and asked Mom, "Are you happy with the $9,000 my wife sends you every month?" I froze. My heart didn't know whether to laugh or break. I looked at him, my boy in his tailored suit smelling of money and distance, and said softly, "Son, the church is keeping me alive these days." His smile faded. And just then she walked in his elegant wife with perfume, worth more than my monthly groceries. Her heels clicked like small accusations against my worn-out floorboards. In that moment, I realized something was terribly wrong. But I stayed quiet, because sometimes silence is the only weapon a mother has left. I'm Mayless Blythe, 66, and this is the story of how a single question over dinner exposed years of lies, greed, and the price of forgetting where you came from. Before I share my story, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you're from. I love hearing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And if my story touches your heart, please don't forget to subscribe. Not for me, but for every mother who was ever made to feel invisible. Mother's Day always used to mean something soft and familiar. The smell of peach cobbler baking the sound of the river wind rustling through the magnolias, and the echo of my husband's old laugh still living in the wood of this house. That morning, I'd set the table for 3. My son Caspian hadn't been home in almost 6 months, and when he finally texted coming by today, I spent hours dusting shelves that didn't need dusting. The clock ticked too loud, the kind of ticking that reminds you of what used to be. Then I heard the tires on the gravel and his voice at the door, "Mom." He looked older, thinner, sharper around the jaw, but still my boy. He came in with a bouquet of green magnolias, their petals damp with morning rain, and that bright, distracted smile of someone who hasn't looked at you properly in a while. "Mom," he said, sitting down and loosening his tie, "are you happy with the $9,000 my wife sends you every month?" I blinked. For a moment, I thought he was joking. What I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted. "The church is keeping me alive these days." I tried to laugh, but my throat betrayed me. The smile fell from his face, confusion spreading across it. "What do you mean?" Isolde said. And right then, she appeared. Isolde Crane, his elegant wife, all poise and perfect posture, wrapped in a satin ivory dress that caught the afternoon light like a blade. Her perfume filled the kitchen, drowning out the scent of my cobbler, cooling by the window. "Oh, Mother," she cooed, resting a manicured hand on Caspian's shoulder. "You must have forgotten." I stopped by every month. I didn't argue. I simply poured her tea, steady hands hiding the tremor beneath my sleeve. "Savannah's been humid lately," I said, changing the subject. "The river wines carry too much salt these days." She smiled politely, that kind of smile that says I win without needing to fight. Caspian watched us uneasy, caught between worlds he didn't understand. I asked about his work, his company, his travels. He spoke in numbers and deadlines, things that used to mean nothing to me, but now meant distance. When they left, I stood at the doorway watching their car disappear down the road toward the city lights that seemed to own them both. My kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old pendulum clock. I turned to the wall where our family photo hung me, my husband Caspian, at 8, and whispered, "Happiness isn't what people say they've done for you. It's what you actually receive." The magnolia petals from Caspian's bouquet had fallen onto the tablecloth, white against white, but somehow bruised. I looked at the small leather notebook hanging by the phone, the one I used to jot down grocery lists. I took it in my hand, weighing it like a promise. The wind from the Wilmington River came through the window, carrying salt, and something else, a warning. If my daughter-in-law was telling the truth, where had that money gone? And if she was lying, how had she fooled him so easily? The clock ticked again, steady and patient. Truth, it seemed to say, will arrive on time. The next morning, sunlight filtered through lace curtains, painting the floor in tired squares of gold. I sat at the kitchen table, the leather notebook open before me. On the first page, I wrote in neat accountant's handwriting, "Find the truth. Don't trust velvet tears." After breakfast, I packed a small tote documents glasses and the willpower of someone who's been underestimated too long and walked to St. Augustine Church. The bells were already ringing and the air smelled of candle wax and salt water. Father Alaric was in his office sorting donation forms. "Maëlys," he said kindly, "you look burdened." I smiled thinly. "Just a bit of bookkeeping, Father." He offered a food basket as always, and I accepted with thanks, pretending not to notice the pity behind his eyes. My fridge was nearly empty, but pride kept me from saying it aloud. Outside, I caught the bus to Live Oak Community Bank. The white tiles gleamed too bright. The air smelled like disinfectant and money. I asked the young teller, a woman barely older than Caspian's interns, to print every deposit from the last 8 months. She clicked away on her keyboard, then frowned. "Mrs. Blythe, there are no deposits except for your account interest." I felt my stomach tighten. "No transfers, none at all." She shook her head. "No, ma'am, but there was a system inquiry on your account about 4 months ago. You didn't request that, no?" I said quietly. "I didn't." She bit her lip, hesitating. "Well, sometimes clients open subaccounts under family names to manage funds. We've seen a few cases, usually adult children handling finances for their parents. Not all of them legitimate." I nodded, the words sinking like stones. "I see. May I have those records stamped? When I left, the sun was high and merciless." I sat on a bench outside, flipping through the pages of the statement. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, though the wind was still. No $9,000. No transfer. Just silence in print. I caught my reflection in the glass door of the bank. The woman staring back at me wasn't just old, she was underestimated. "Memory," I whispered to her reflection, "is the only ledger that never lies." Back home, I spread everything on the dining table. The stamped bank statement, the church receipts from each week's food basket, the empty envelopes I'd saved just in case. Each item became a line in an equation I could almost balance but not yet solve. I opened the notebook again and wrote beneath my first line, March 10th, Caspian's question. April 5th, Isolde's visit claim, I stop by every month. No transactions found. Possible unauthorized inquiry. Suspect subaccount. The house felt still, like it was listening. I looked out the window toward the river. The magnolias swayed their petals heavy from yesterday's rain. Somewhere out there, Isolde was probably sipping imported coffee, completely sure I'd never ask questions. But I would. Just not yet. When Father Alaric called that evening to ask if I was all right, I told him I was fine, that I'd just been sorting old papers. He said gently, "Don't be afraid of the truth, Maëlys. It comes to set you free." I smiled at the phone receiver, whispering more to myself than to him. "I'm not afraid of the truth, Father. I'm afraid it might come too soon before I'm ready to prove it." After we hung up, I placed the notebook beside the clock. The pendulum swung in steady rhythm, each tick like a heartbeat reminding me of time and patience. Somewhere between those ticks, I could almost hear Isolde's voice again, sweet as sugar and sharp as glass. "Stress isn't good for memory, Mother." Maybe not, but my memory was doing just fine. I closed the notebook and whispered to the quiet room. If there's a sub-account under my name, someone opened it for a reason, and I intend to find out who. The wind from the river pressed against the window, rattling the pane. The magnolia petals stirred again. This time, they didn't fall, they waited. So did I. By late afternoon, the air over Thunderbolt hung heavy and still, the kind of heat that presses on your chest and makes the sound of cicadas feel like static in your ears. I sat at the old wooden table beneath the magnolia vines, a cup of black tea cooling between my hands. The river moved slow behind the house, carrying that briny savanna scent I'd known my whole life. That's when I saw her Porsche, a new Taycan Silver as a blade, the kind of car that doesn't belong on a street full of rusted mailboxes and oak trees draped in Spanish moss. She stepped out like she was arriving for a photo shoot, not a visit with her husband's mother. "Mother Blythe?" she said, smiling with teeth that caught the light I was in the neighborhood coming from a charity meeting. "I thought I'd bring you something sweet." She handed me a small white box of cookies tied with a gold ribbon. The label read, "Madeleines of Paris. They cost more than my week of groceries." "Thank you," I said, motioning to the chair across from me. She sat gracefully crossing one leg over the other, her perfume slicing through the damp air. "How's the charity work?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Busy," she sighed, brushing imaginary crumbs from her skirt. "Between Caspian's business and all my events, I hardly sleep." I nodded slowly, pretending to sip my tea. Then I said, as if it were nothing, "Remind me, darling, what day do you usually send the deposit?" She looked at me and smiled too fast. "The 5th, every month. Regular as clockwork." "The 5th," I repeated, writing the date in my mind. "Yes," she said, reaching for her cookie box. "I make sure it's handled personally. That's very kind of you." I said, then let my gaze slide toward the shiny Porsche parked by the fence. New car. Her expression brightened immediately. "Yes, isn't she lovely? The company thought it was time I drove something more professional." I smiled, though I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. The word company rolled off her tongue like perfume, too practiced, too perfect. Just then my phone rang. Father Alaric's name flashed on the screen. "Excuse me," I said, answering. "Father, how are you?" I listened to his voice, calm as river water, asking if I was eating well. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Isolde glance at the phone, then look away quickly, her jaw tight. When I hung up, she was already standing. "I should go," she said, forcing a light laugh. "Too many errands, you know how it is." I walked her to the car. The afternoon light bounced off the hood, nearly blinding me. As she opened the door, I noticed something on the passenger seat, a cream-colored envelope from Live Oak Community Bank stamped SA. I didn't touch it. I didn't ask, but I memorized every letter. She slipped into the driver's seat and smiled through the window. "Take care, Mother Blythe. Don't stress too much. Stress isn't good for memory." I held her gaze. "Memory is my ledger," I said softly, "and ledgers don't forget." When she drove off, I took out my old flip phone and snapped a picture of her temporary license plate. Then I sat back down at the table, lifted my cup, and saw that a magnolia petal had fallen into my tea. I stirred it gently, watching it float to the top. "Leaves rise," I whispered, "and so will the truth." That evening, I opened the leather notebook. On the next page, I wrote in careful pen strokes, "May 5th, visit from Isolde. Brought cookies. New Tay can. Said she sends deposits on the 5th. Live Oak envelope on seat. Perfume Chanel. Avoided eye contact when asked about money." I closed the book and set it on the windowsill. For the first time since Mother's Day, the house felt alive, listening with me. I asked myself a question I already knew the answer to. If she sends the money on the 5th and Caspian's system runs the 12th, where exactly does it go in between? The magnolias rustled in the river wind, whispering secrets to the night. I listened. The next morning began gray and swollen with fog. From my porch, the river was just a moving shadow. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and sat at the small wooden table, the one that still smelled faintly of last night's tea. The magnolias had wilted their petals, bruised with the damp air. That's when I saw a man walking up my gravel path, a tall figure in a wrinkled gray suit, carrying a leather folder under one arm. He paused at the steps and tipped his hat. "Mrs. Blythe." "Yes." "My name's Eamon Whitlock," he said. "I'm the chief accountant at Blythe Labs. May I have a word?" Something in his voice, a kind of weary integrity, made me nod. Of course. He sat across from me, set down the folder, and exhaled a thin trail of cigarette smoke. "I don't want to alarm you, ma'am," he began, "but I came across some financial records that don't add up. I thought you should know." He opened the folder and spread out 8 sheets of paper neatly aligned like confessions. Each was a transfer authorization for $9,000, one per month. Each bore my name, Maylis Blythe, and my son's signature at the bottom. But the contact email wasn't mine. It was Isolde's. These payments, Eamon said tapping the papers were supposed to go directly to your account, but the deposits were rerouted to a sub-account opened under your name using a scanned copy of an ID, the address listed. He glanced down. Ardsley Park. That was where Isolde lived. My mouth went dry. You're saying... She opened an account pretending to be me, yes ma'am, and Mr. Blythe unknowingly signed the authorization. He probably thought it was standard procedure. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the world tilt slightly. Why are you telling me this, Mr. Whitlock? You could lose your job. He looked out toward the river. Because I also have a mother, and I wouldn't want her to be cheated in silence. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The fog pressed against the porch screens, turning everything gray and secretive. He slid a smaller document across the table, credit card summaries, linked to the company account. Mrs. Crane Isolde has used the corporate card for several personal purchases. Spa treatments, jewelry, 2 flights to Palm Beach, and a down payment on that Porsche Taycan parked outside your fence last week. I didn't speak. My pulse thudded in my ears. She's careful, he added, but not perfect. All the big expenses line up with those supposed deposits to you. He gathered the papers into a neat stack, then looked at me again. There's more. Mr. Blythe received a tax notice about a trust fund in your name. If the IRS audits, he could face liability. I felt an ache rise from my chest, old and sharp. Caspian's signature on those transfers looked so proud, so certain. He'd thought he was helping his mother. Instead, he was being used. Eamon reached for his folder but paused. You didn't get this from me. Not yet. Keep the copies. Decide what to do when you're ready. Thank you, I said quietly. You've done the right thing. As he stood to leave, he looked at my notebook lying open on the table. You were an accountant, weren't you? I smiled faintly. Once. I used to balance ledgers for other people's mistakes. Now I suppose I'm balancing my family's. He nodded. Some numbers don't lie, Mrs. Blythe. No, I said, closing the folder, but people use them to hide the truth. He left through the mist, his footsteps fading down the road, until the only sound left was the creak of my porch swing. I sat for a long while staring at those papers at my own forged name, staring back at me in clean black ink. When the fog began to lift, I noticed the magnolia petals clinging to the edge of the table, their scent faint but stubborn. I picked up my pen and opened the notebook again. On the fresh page, I wrote June 3rd, meeting with Eamon Whitlock. 8 false transfers. Sub-account ID fake address Ardsley Park. Caspian's auto transfer scheduled the 12th. Isolde claims deposits on the 5th. Time gap 7 days. The money travels through her hands. I underlined the last sentence twice. Then I looked toward the river. The sun was pushing through the fog, now sharp and white, cutting a line across the water. For the first time in months, I felt something close to certainty. I'd found the pattern, and I knew what came next. Sunday night arrived soft and sugar-coated, the kind of evening that pretends nothing can go wrong. I laid out my small table like a memory garlic butter roast chicken skillet, cornbread, a cheap white wine that tasted honest because it couldn't afford to lie. I called it Mother's Sunday Revisit and set 3 plates beneath the low gold light. When Caspian and Isolde walked in, the house smelled like the past. He kissed my cheek, cautious eyes moving over the room like he was afraid to break it. She drifted to her chair, satin whispering against wood, the glass beads at her throat flashing whenever she turned her head. I served the chicken and waited until the plates were warm and the small talk had used up its shine. Then I said lightly, I'm grateful for this month's help. I finally bought a space heater before the damp gets into my bones. Caspian smiled relief moving across his face like sunrise. Good, he said. That's exactly why Isolde cut in with a bright chirp. Mother, you've been receiving it regularly on the 5th, yes. She lifted her glass and took a slow sip, eyes on me over the rim. Caspian froze mid-bite. The 5th. He set down his fork. I set the transfer on the 12th. The room shrank around the words. Isolde let out a small laugh that sounded like a spoon tapping a cracked teacup. Banks change their batch days sometimes. It must be a processing shift. I glanced at the candlelight trembling inside her wine glass and kept my tone mild. Which schedule is right? Then I'm old-fashioned. I like dates I can write down. Silence tugged at the corners of the room. Caspian cleared his throat and asked about my garden as if the question were a window he could jump through. I told him the magnolias were holding out against the heat and the river had been too loud at night. We ate. I poured more wine. When Isolde stood to help with dishes, I did what every mother does when she's treated like she can't keep up. I kept up. I stacked plates washed carefully and slid her glass into the dish rack away from the others, the print of her fingers still silvered in the waxy light. The receipt for the wine stayed folded in my apron pocket like a little paper truth. By the door, she thanked me with that sweet glazed voice. "Mother, don't strain yourself. We'll send another envelope so you won't have to worry." I inched the latch open against the evening breeze and nodded as if the world were already easy. "Drive safe," I said. "Wind's high on the causeway tonight." Her smile flickered, then steadied. Caspian hugged me longer than usual. "We should do this more often," he murmured, but his eyes were somewhere else counting days. When their car vanished down the bend, the house exhaled. I wiped the table, dried my hands, and opened the leather notebook. I wrote slowly so each letter would carry weight, 5th versus 12th. She spoke first. He hesitated. Which calendar governs the truth? I added a second line beneath it. Collected her glass. Keep for later comparison. Then I sat at the old computer, opened a new email, and typed only 2 words to the 2 people who needed to see them most. It's time. I sent it to Eamon Whitlock and to Marin Quaid, my friend, from a life when I solved problems with numbers instead of prayers. Before bed, I stood in the dark kitchen and listened to the river knocking at the banks. I asked the room a question that had stopped being theoretical the moment Isolde said the 5th out loud. If my son must choose, will he pick the story that soothes him or the one that saves him? The candle coughed, then steadied. I turned off the light. Numbers don't care about feelings, neither does the tide. The church basement always smelled like old wood candle smoke and coffee left too long on a hot plate. We met there the next morning beneath stained glass that threw patient colors on the floor. Eamon arrived in his scuffed shoes and clean conscience. Marin came in a navy blazer with a legal pad and a pen that clicked like a metronome. We spread everything across the table until it looked less like paper and more like a map out of a bad country. Eamon started with the ledger of harm. 8 transfers at $9,000 each, he said, laying the pages in 2 even rows. $72,000 total. Payee name reads Maylise Blythe. Beneficiary contact points to Isolde's email. Sub-account opened using a scanned ID that isn't your original. Registered address, Ardsley Park. He slid over the bank's confirmation letter stamped and signed. They'll testify the sub-account didn't originate from you. Marin read every line, her eyes slowing on the signatures. Caspian's authorization is valid, she said, but it was obtained for a purpose he didn't understand. These purchases, spa packages, jewelry flights, plus a deposit on the Taycan lineup date for date, with the outgoing transfers. She touched the stack of receipts like she was praying with them. This is enough to proceed on elder financial exploitation and fraud. If we file now, the court will move quickly. Not yet, I said. The words surprised me with how steady they were. He has to see it with his own eyes before any judge does. Otherwise, he'll spend the rest of his life thinking I took him to war when I could have taken him to the truth. Eamon nodded, jaw tight. There's something else, he said. Company compliance flagged a random review. If this spills without context, your son could face exposure for the so-called family trust. He needs daylight, not disaster. Marin flipped a page, then paused. And this morning she added another $9,000 left his account. She hasn't stopped. We can catch it in motion. The room fell quiet except for the soft drip of rain outside and the church bell marking the half hour. I felt no anger, only clarity. Then we'll stage clarity, I said. Here, invite them to a small charity dinner for senior aid. Let Truth sit at the center of the table and introduce herself. Marin's mouth curved into a tired smile. We'll create a social witness. Father Alaric can be present. Eamon, you'll attend as a guest. I'll prepare a condensed packet that even heartbreak can't ignore. We name the binder together because names matter when you're building a spine for the weak part of your life. The Magnolia File. Eamon wrote it on the tab in block letters. Because magnolias bloom hardest when the air turns cold, Marin said, closing the rings with a click that sounded like a lock sliding home. I placed my notebook beside it and wrote a line on a blank page. The day of truth is now on the calendar. Later, in a cut of the world that wasn't mine to control, Caspian sat under office lights, as white as hospital sheets, and opened an email about a compliance review. He rubbed his eyes and asked for coffee. Across town, Isolde paced their kitchen phone to her ear voice, low and quick. She told someone she'd handle it because that's how people talk when they think money is a broom that can sweep shame under a rug. A ping landed in Eamon's inbox by accident, an email meant for a banker, confirmed transfer to O. Blythe act rush if possible. He printed it, slid it into a plastic sleeve, and didn't say anything until he could say everything. Back in the basement, the rain thickened. We rehearsed what not to say. I would not accuse. Eamon would not editorialize. Marin would speak only to clarify when paper and silence had done their work. Father Alaric would open with a prayer about dignity, because even justice behaves better when it's been to church first. I handed Marin the wine receipt from last night and told her I'd saved a certain glass in my dish rack. She wrote a note on her pad, not because she needed it, but because details are the thread that stitches truth to consequence. When we finished, Eamon closed the binder and pushed it toward me. You shouldn't have to carry it, he said, but it belongs to you. I rested my palm on the cover, feeling the cold bite through the plastic. I'll carry it, I said. Tomorrow it can carry us. We walked up the narrow stairs into the main hall. The stained glass had dimmed to a softer blue, the kind that forgives. Outside, the rain stitched the street into a single sheet of water. I stood by the door and watched a magnolia petal loosen, tilt, and fall quiet, deliberate, inevitable. That night, at my kitchen table, I set a single place and ate slowly like time could be persuaded to be gentle. I opened the leather notebook to a fresh page and wrote the invitation list in tidy lines, then the menu, then a sentence that felt like a vow. Mercy follows truth, not ahead of it. I sealed the envelopes with fingers that no longer shook. On the last one, I paused thinking of my boy at 8, of his lopsided grin and skinned knees, and the way he used to say, "Mom, promise me the world is fair." I whispered into the paper, I can't promise that, baby, but I can promise you'll see it clearly. I stacked the letters, turned off the lamp, and listened to the river answer the rain. Somewhere upstream, the water was gathering itself. So was I. Tomorrow I would lay a table, and when my son sat down, the magnolia would open. Late weekend light softened the church hall into something almost tender. White cloth down the long table, blue magnolias in mason jars, a tray of casseroles the ladies insisted on bringing, and the organ murmuring like a prayer behind closed doors. I welcomed everyone with a steady voice, neighbors, a few elders from the parish, Father Alaric, at the head Eamon near the aisle, and Marin with her slim binder. Caspian and Isolde arrived last, his hand at the small of her back, her smile polished unbreakable. "Thank you for coming to our little charity dinner for senior aid," I said. "Tonight is about sharing stories, bread, and a little light." We ate in the soft hum of small talk. I waited until the plates thinned, until the room felt held. Then I reached for the envelope set in the center, the one labeled Donations June. "Caspian," I said, sliding it toward him, "would you read the list for us?" He opened it. The list wasn't names of donors. It was 8 printed statements, monthly transfers from his account to an account named for me, tagged to an address in Ardsley Park. His eyes stuttered down the page, then rose to mine. I didn't speak. I turned my gaze to Isolde. She smiled too brightly. "That must be a bookkeeping hiccup," she said. "You know how banks are." Eamon stood. "No hiccup," he said gently. "I prepared those records." He set a second packet beside Caspian's plate. Marin opened her binder. Under Georgia Code 3058, she read evenly, "This pattern qualifies as elder financial exploitation, false account, diverted funds, and personal benefit." Color drained from Caspian's face. "Isolde," he whispered, "is this real?" Her breath hitched, the performance quivering. I was under pressure. "Your mother forgets things." "I only enough," I said, quiet but final. "I don't forget Isolde." I stayed silent so my son could see. The room held its breath. Father Alaric folded his hands. "Let truth free the hearts in this room," he said. "Let pride step aside." Isolde pushed back from her chair so quickly it scraped the floor. Heels struck tile like nails in wood as she hurried for the door, the magnolia centerpieces shivering in her wake. The hall settled into a stunned stillness. Caspian sat down, hard elbows on the table, head in his hands. I reached into my bag and placed a second envelope in front of him. "This one is for later," I said. "It holds the originals and a letter I wrote when I could not speak." Marin laid a single printed email beside the statements. "She sent this by mistake," Marin said softly. "Instructions to move funds to Mother's account to the sub-account she controls." Eamon remained standing, hands loose at his sides. "I'll testify," he said. "Not against you, Caspian, for the numbers." I looked at my son's bent head and felt grief and relief braided together. "Justice doesn't need noise," I said. "It only needs light." He lifted his face, eyes raw. "Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner? Because if I said it, you wouldn't hear. Tonight your own eyes did the work." Father Alaric rose. "Some lies fear the church lights more than any courtroom," he said, and the organ gave a soft, accidental chord like an amen. Caspian stood slowly, envelope in hand. A blue magnolia petal loosened from the centerpiece and fell onto his white shirt, a small stubborn bloom against the fabric. He pressed his lips together and nodded once, as if agreeing to see at last what had always been there. As guests drifted out with careful hugs, I stayed back, my notebook open to a blank final page. The candlelight trembled across it. I left that page empty. The story wasn't over yet, and Mercy still had a part to play. In the weeks after the dinner, the house went quiet in a new way. Caspian filed with Marin's help, but he asked the judge for leniency. "Hold her accountable," he said in his statement, "but don't grind her into dust." The court listened and did its duty. Isolde was found guilty of exploiting an elder, ordered to repay the $72,000 barred from managing family finances for 5 years, and assigned a rehabilitation program. Consequence, not vengeance. Caspian moved into my spare room for a while, wearing guilt like an old sweater he couldn't take off. He'd sit on the porch and stare at the river until the light thinned. I made tea, set it near his hand, and said the only thing that helped, let good work lift you. We drafted plans at the kitchen table and chose a name that felt like a promise. Blue Magnolia Foundation, helping elders reclaim dignity. We filed the paperwork with Marin. Eamon built the books. I brought my ledger habits out of retirement, and we used the repaid funds to seed something kinder than the pain that bought them. We started small in a church office that hummed when the HVAC kicked on. We printed checklists for seniors, how to spot forged authorizations, how to freeze credit, how to question sub-accounts. Caspian offered free Saturday sessions on digital safety, translating the cold grammar of security into plain speech. Eamon taught volunteers to read statements the way a ship's captain reads tides. Marin sat with clients and explained the law without turning their shame into spectacle. We measured success in return deposits and return sleep. One wet afternoon a year later, a letter came from the State Welfare Commission. Blue Magnolia had been selected as an exemplary community model. We didn't cheer. We just stood together a little closer, as if bracing against the same rain. At the ceremony in the Georgia Civic Hall, I wore a simple blue dress and used the handrail on the steps because wisdom and rails are both there to keep you steady. Caspian sat in the first row, eyes bright and red around the edges. "Justice isn't revenge," I said into the microphone. "It's remembering who you are and acting like it." The applause felt like rain on tin gentle, honest enough. Afterward, Caspian hugged me like the boy who once asked if the world could be fair. "Mom," he said, voice breaking. "Thank you for showing me what truth looks like. Truth doesn't need makeup, son," I told him. "It only needs courage." Back at the river house, the porch boards were new. The roof tight, the garden fuller than it had ever been. Blue magnolias opened against the drizzle, their color deeper in the wet. On my office wall, we hung a small sign, "Blue Magnolia Foundation," and beneath it, a glass case with my leather notebook open not to the evidence, but to a fresh page. Across the bottom in my neat script, "Truth waits for courage." A week later, a letter arrived postmarked from a rehabilitation center. It was from Isolde. She wrote that she was learning the meaning of repair, that being forgiven before being sentenced had unsettled her more than any verdict. She didn't ask to be welcomed back. She thanked me for leaving the courtroom door open in the first place. Every month, a small donation came through with no note from an anonymous parishioner. I recognized the handwriting on the envelope from the parish ledger. I didn't say a word. Faith works best when it's busy and quiet. On a rainy evening near the year's turn, we closed the office after a training session. Volunteers stacked chairs. Eamon shut down the laptops. Marin ran her finger down the next day's docket. Caspian taped a flyer to the door about a new hotline. I stepped onto the porch and watched a magnolia petal loosen and fall blue as evening. The river wind smelled clean. My chest felt both light and full. "Truth doesn't come late," I said mostly to myself. "It waits until we're ready to open the door." Caspian joined me, hands in his pockets, shoulders easier than they'd been in a long time. I used to think justice was a verdict he said. Turns out, it's light. In that light, I answered, "You can finally see yourself." He nodded, and we stood there, mother and son, watching the rain write soft lines on the steps. I am not the woman who needed saving anymore. I am the woman who keeps the lamp trimmed and the ledger clean, who teaches others to name what's being taken from them and to take it back. The blue magnolias shook in the wind and held. Somewhere inside the office, the notebook lay open to its clean page, ready for the next name, the next story, the next small rescue. The river moved on, carrying salt and memory, and something else, the steady current of a life reclaimed.